Hello, I'm Bob Booker. Welcome to my channel, and I'm joined today by the wonderful Neil Bartlett. We're going to be talking a little bit about his book, The Disappearance Boy, right here. And we're sort of going to go through, there we go. We're going to go through a few little bits talking about this book. But I think, Neil, just firstly, if you want to start by introducing yourself and saying a little bit about this book.
Hello. It's lovely to see you again, Bob. So I'm Neil Bartlett. I've been writing books, oh Lord, for a long time. My first book came out in 1988, and this is The Disappearance Boy is an especial favorite of mine. It's actually my novel before last, my penultimate novel. And its previous publishers, in their wisdom, let it go out of print, and somebody else approached me, the very wonderful Incandescent approached me, particularly Justin approached me and said, oh God, I love that book so much, and somebody told me they couldn't get hold of it. Could we republish it? So I thought for 2 seconds and said, darling, of course you can. And now it's made its way back into the world. I love the idea that a novel called The Disappearance Boy disappeared, and now someone's made it come back. It's set in the world of magic. It mostly happens backstage in a tatty variety theatre in the spring and summer of 1953. And the disappearance boy of the title is everybody has seen an illusion act, and the classic form of the illusion act is there's the magician, almost always a man, certainly in 1953, always a man, but even so, always a man, and sometimes with a glamorous female assistant. And there's usually a box, and the woman usually ends up in the box, and then she vanishes. What people don't know about illusion acts is there's almost always somebody else on stage who you don't see. And that's the disappearance boy, the hidden member of the team who is actually making the trick happen. I fell in love with magic when I was a very little boy. My grandfather was a rather talented amateur magician, and he would do tricks like he could make. I had a pet rabbit. And once on my birthday, he brought the rabbit hutch into the house and then put a cloth over the hutch, and the rabbit disappeared, but my birthday cake was inside. And he also had a couple of books written by one by Davenant and one by Jasper Maskelyne, very famous Edwardian practitioners of white magic and the arts of illusion. So illusion is something that has always fascinated me. And then by the long, mysterious process, which I don't really understand, of how ideas arrive. This character arrived, first of all, he had a body and had a face, and then he started to have a way of walking and a way of being, and he had a name, and then that coincided with the idea of him having this extraordinary job. And then I thought, oh yes, wait a minute, as a queer person, I know all about being the person who gets locked in boxes. I know all about being made to disappear. And I know all about how to escape. And so in essence, that's the story of the book. It's the story of actually the two people in the magic act, because in this, well, no, I shouldn't say any more. That's the thing about magic. One shouldn't say too much, because I don't want to spoil the book for anybody who reads it. So we must be very careful on the spoiler alerts, Bob.
Yes. I mean, I think that's, again, without spoiling it myself, I think that's something that I found so engaging about the book, is that it, because it plays so much on this idea of peeking behind the curtain of magic tricks, it itself kind of almost seeks to do some of those same things to the reader, and again, without giving things away. How did you go about kind of writing a book that was about magic? So what does that sort of research process look like? What does it look like to kind of write those scenes and kind of imagine yourself in the background
Yeah.
of all of these acts happening.
Well, of course, I work, as well as writing books, I work in the theatre. I've been working as a theatre director. And so the backstage world, the corridors, the lights around the mirror, the smell, the sweat, the giggles, the nervousness, the suddenly turning. Someone can be in the wings in the foulest mood imaginable. The stage manager hisses you're on and you see them transform into someone else. All of that I knew intimately. And indeed, the actual the theatre that the novel is set in is actually a building that burned down in the early 60s. It was very important to me that it took place in somewhere that only can be known in fiction.
Right.
But of course, what I did when I was writing the book was draw on every backstage. You know, I've been touring for 40 years. I know about backstage lives. So every detail of the building that you read about in the book is real.
Right.
With writing about a magic act in particular, well, in one way, it was very easy because, as I say, the art of secrecy, the art of being not seen, the art of transformation. These are things. I'm a 65-year-old gay man. So all of that I know emotionally deeply,
Right.
that sense of, so the Disappearance Boy's job is to be locked inside a suffocating box, which then suddenly produces a gloriously transformed human being. Well, I'm a child of the 50s. I was born in 1958. I was a queer teenager in the early 70s. So that the emotional dynamics of that I knew all about. How I researched the actual magic act that I describe in the book, I can't actually tell you. Somebody helped me do it on agreement I would never talk about it. The book carries an epigraph in it right at the beginning. It has some words of Latin, and it says "Indocilis privata loqui," and that means it is impermissible to speak about that which ought to remain private. It's a rather beautiful phrase, and it's the motto of the Magic Circle.
Yeah.
And for many generations, it was the motto of queer life.
Yeah.
Darling, you can do it. Please don't talk about it. Or don't talk, in my young life, don't talk about it because you'll get arrested.
Right.
So some of the trickery I knew about because I've done theatre pieces where I've worked with an illusionist. So I
Right.
did a production of The Picture of Dorian Gray at the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, where we did a transformation on stage. There was a picture with a beautiful
Right.
young man, and it turned into a hideous old man in front of the audience eyes. And everyone said, Jesus H on a bike, how did you do that? Well, one, I'm not going to tell you.
Right.
Two, if I told you how easy it was,
Right.
you would be horrified that your senses had been fooled. So a very few pieces of key information about how the central trick in the book works went a very long way.
Okay.
But yes, that a few clues from books. There are magic manuals from the 1950s, which I
Yeah.
looked at. A lot of clues from my own emotional life, a lot of clues from my career in the theatre. And then one crucial afternoon spent with somebody who would be in incredible trouble if I ever divulged their name.
Super. I
Which
won't press you on
I love that secret
There's
thing.
something quite delicious about that, isn't there?
I mean, a very interesting thing about the new edition of the book,
Yes.
it's got a beautiful new cover, but I persuaded Mr. Derren Brown, who's a rather famous illusionist and magician, to talk to me about the book and about these interconnected ideas of queerness and the profession of being an illusionist, and that's tucked away in the back of the book as an afterword.
Mm.
And that was extraordinary talking to him, because Derren is famously frank and gorgeously articulate and talks very powerfully about how his queerness and his magic
Mm.
interconnect. And all the time you're talking to him, you have this marvelous sense of the curtain behind which you
Right.
not peek. And that makes talking to him very exciting. And it was I couldn't believe he said yes. I mean, I just got in touch with him through a mutual friend and said,
Right.
can I send you this book? And then maybe we could talk about it and I could publish our interview. And he literally just said yes, which
I was
was
wondering how that had come about.
amazing. Yeah.
'Cause, yeah.
As I say, I went, oh, wait a minute. I bet, again, person who shall remain nameless, I bet
Mhm.
she knows Derren. And I said, you don't have Derren's number. And she said, well, actually, yes, he's gorgeous. So let me ask him. And he just said yes. So how fantastic.
That's amazing.
And yes.
Yeah.
So
No, and without giving anything away about the ending of that book, I think there is something really quite special about finishing the book. Finishing reading the book, kind of getting to that sort of conclusion, and then reading this really interesting transcript of an interview, of a conversation between yourself
yeah,
and Derren Brown, because I think, exactly as you said, some of these themes around queerness and being an outsider, and the ways that telling a story is sort of both a truth and not a truth at the
yeah,
same time, right? That you kind of, it feels true to you. The person receiving it receives it as a true story in some capacity, but you're both also playing little parts behind the curtains to kind of
yeah,
edit that story in your own way. And I thought that was really quite interesting. And I thought that was really interestingly mirrored in the book itself, with not only Reggie as this sort of outsider figure in many ways,
yeah,
but also there's this sort of I'm telling you a story kind of narrator kind of throughout. And part of that narrator's role is to sort of say, oh, well, I'll tell you a bit more about that later, or let me quickly interject here to tell you that this thing happened in this year. And I thought I loved that kind of mirroring of not only sort of things that came up later in that conversation, but also that sense of otherness, that there is a kind of a constant negotiation between privacy and secrets and the sort of the externally facing
yeah.
world. So I'm kind of curious about your sort of decision when you're writing. Was that narrator sort of figure always there, or you said that you sort of had a really strong image of Reggie as well? How did they
Yeah.
both enter the narrative for you?
Well, I think it's how I tell stories.
Right.
I think a story is a conversation. I don't think it's a sermon.
Mm.
Um, I think a story is a seduction. Um, I love to lay a trail of breadcrumbs for
Mm.
the reader. And while I'm doing it, I say, you do know this is a trail of breadcrumbs, don't you? You do
Mm.
know you're consenting to come into the forest with me. That's true of my theatre work.
Mm.
Um, I love to make it very clear to the audience, listen, this requires your consent.
Yeah.
I don't operate in the realm of, well, we all know what's going on, don't we? This is
Right.
called realism. These are real people. We all know how that behaves. No, my fiction operates in the realm of, what if the thing that they always told you was impossible is
Mm.
in fact possible? I mean, that's particularly true of this book. And
Yeah.
it relates deeply to my life experience and to the experience of my generation, because the thing that was impossible, I'm impossible. Uh, Red, I am, to that extent, I am Reggie. I
Right.
am the person who was told in his childhood, you are not possible. At the very best, you are only possible if you remain hidden.
Mm.
And yet here I am,
Mm.
far from hidden. And
Yeah.
here we are, far from hidden. And the other person in the book, um, the wonderful Pamela,
I
Miss
love
Pamela
them.
Rose, who is the
Mm.
magician's assistant. Of course, she's a woman making her way in the world in 1953. She's, before she gets roped into the act, she's a dancer. Well, she appears at Murray's Club on
Mm.
Beak Street in Soho, which is where Christine Keeler worked. And so she's someone else who is told she's not really possible. It's not really possible to be a woman. You can't, or you can only be a woman if you play by very strict rules.
Mm.
And she too, gloriously, with Reggie's help, finds a way of, shall we say, redeploying those rules to her own advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I'm fascinated by the possibilities of the reader colluding with the writer. And I think
Mm.
that's why often in my fiction, as well as in my theatre, there's this rather conspiratorial, often sexy,
Mm.
um, storytelling voice that says, well, of course, if you'd been there, you might have noticed this.
Right.
But on the other hand, you might be the sort of person who never notices such details. But I rather think you must be, because after all, you've chosen my book.
Mm.
And I mean, there's a key moment in the book where the storyteller says, people think magicians lie,
Mm.
illusionists lie. No, no, illusionists absolutely keep their promise to you. It's
Yes.
just that their promise is that they're going to lie.
Yes.
Um, and that's true of fiction, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I do, because I write often about the queer past. People do sometimes get very confused about what in my book is real
Right.
and what is fiction. Um, Actually, in the Disappearance Boy, everything is real.
Mm.
Every It's set in Brighton in 1953. Every street. I mean, there's one chapter where Reggie crosses the town at night, and he turns right, and he turns left, and he turns right, and he turns left. You could use this, but if you listen to the audible version of the book blindfolded, you could get from the theatre stage door to where he ends up, the
Mm.
specific point on Brighton Beach where he ends up. It's all true.
Yeah.
But there are other occasions in my other novel writing where people have said to me, I went to find the house in the book and it's not there. How dare you? You made it up. I love it when people get confused about that. Love it when that happens.
But yeah, I think you're right, because so much of that partner, this sort of reader-writer partnership, is that there are some sort of things where we might have certain expectations, and sometimes the writer
Yeah,
can meet or purposely not meet those. But I think, interestingly here, I think the what I found was really interesting about that relationship between myself as a reader and the sort of authorly voice coming through was this the sense that, yeah, typically somebody like Pamela, in a book, she would be a side character and we'd hear very, very little about her inner life. The book would largely be focused on the central magician. We would spend most of our novel experience learning about their intricacies of their background. And I think what I found really interesting is, I mean, and for most of this, the magician is referred to as Mr. Brooks.
yeah,
That extra little level of distance that, and so actually I found something really quite interesting about that. The fact that it is this novel, not only because the title is The Disappearance Boy, it's not focused on this magician, but that we do get to actually live in the world of what's happening behind the scenes a little bit more. And I think that felt for me far more engaging than I could imagine the opposite would have been of focusing on him centrally. And so sort of particularly, and we have Sandra at the beginning of the book as well, and I found her portrayal really interesting as sort of a character sort of almost setting up some of the other parts of this as well. In sort of focusing on those characters, sort of what was, with, I suppose what I'm trying to say is in terms of writing them versus writing Mr. Brooks, how was that experience for you? Because Mr. Brooks is himself a complicated and interesting character, but we do see him from afar most of the time.
Yeah. It's interesting. The disappointing news is I'm not a terribly self-conscious writer. I don't sit down and go, well, obviously, it would be more interesting to hear from the perspective of the disenfranchised. No, as Pamela appeared in the novel, I mean, to talk about the female characters, Sandra, you mentioned. Well, Sandra is only in the book for about 3.5 pages, but I just loved her. I love her. I think she's extraordinary. She became very real very quickly. And then Pamela, well, I fell in love with Pamela. That's why she's called Pamela. Pamela was my mother's name.
Ah, right.
And I wouldn't give that name to a character that I didn't deeply love and who wasn't a very special person to me. I love her nerve. I love her courage. I love her physical courage. I love what a complete mess she is. I love the fact that she goes to bed with the wrong men and then walks home in the early hours of the morning, having got herself totally in a pickle, and sits in a cafe with a cup of tea and a fag and thinking, I must stop doing it. Hello, have any of us done that? So I love those things about her.
Yeah.
Mr. Brooks, the magician, is an evil, small-minded, manipulative psychopath.
Yeah.
And however, I was really surprised. I mean, I'm not going to say what happens to him at the end of the book, but that was a big surprise for me. I didn't see that one coming.
Oh, interesting.
No, I thought he was. Oh, I can't say anything about it. Otherwise, I'll just say I had absolutely no idea that was going to happen.
Oh, fascinating.
People have asked me about the plotting of the book because it's intricately plotted. It's plotted like a magic act. There have to be lots of sliding panels and special buttons and things that you think you see and things that you don't see. And then it all has to fit together and click. There is the final beat of the illusion. I got more than 2/3 into the book without knowing how it was going to end.
Wow. Right. Which really surprises me, because by the time it hits towards
the end... It terrified me.
Honestly, I'm kind of staggered by that, because it felt that you'd been sort of laying that trail of breadcrumbs since almost the first page. As soon as I look back on it afterwards. I love that there's almost, I suppose, almost you're sort of building towards it without realizing you're building towards it, perhaps. But
well, I think any story worth the telling, for me, the kind of writing that I do, any story that I'm going to commit the amount of time to that it takes me to create this particular, to work in this particular art form, long form literary fiction, it has to come from a very deep place inside me. Otherwise, it's not going to work. But when it is coming from there, it genuinely, at a certain point, starts to write itself.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Fascinating. And I suppose with that, that's sort of interesting for me in terms of, because that part perhaps originally starting less intentionally, but was there a particular intention around sort of some of the time, like the time that you set the novel in, and things
Right.
like that, because it sort of strikes me that's so critical to so much of the book. Particularly, I'm thinking of sort of the early parts of Reggie exploring his sexuality within the book are so
Yeah.
laced with danger, and obviously that in many ways, could still to some degree happen in other time periods. But it struck me that there's something so interesting that so much of his initial understanding of his sexuality is so laced with the fear of a specific time, of people being afraid to,
Although,
people alluding to a bar.
yeah, although of course he does manage to have a really rather wonderful time.
Yeah.
That's really important. Well, the reason for setting it in 1953, I mean, the book climaxes on the night of the coronation. It climaxes with a kind of big set piece where I take you to a theatre in Brighton, and it's the coronation special, and everyone has been listening to the radio all day. This extraordinary thing that happened in Brighton where the buses all stopped. People put their radios on their windowsills so that
Right.
people who didn't have a radio could hear. The entire town, like every other town in the country, experienced that day communally. My parents were married
Right.
in that year, and I was born slightly later in 1958. I am a child in every sense of that mythological moment when the beautiful young princess was crowned and her incredibly good looking 6'2" Prince Charming were the icons
Right.
in whose reflected light my parents, who came from quite humble backgrounds, the two of them, they constructed their early life along that
Right.
model. There was the beautiful young woman, and there was the handsome, slightly taller man. And, my mother and father in their wedding pictures look like nothing so much as Philip
Right.
and Elizabeth. And my mother very consciously modeled her look and her hairstyle on the Queen's sister, Princess Margaret Rose, and who also shadows the book. And so I wanted to touch on that period which created me.
Yeah.
I am a child of that moment in British history, that iconic moment of the history of heterosexuality. There has never been a family more loved, more glorious, and more entirely stereotypical
Yeah.
than our royal family, with the one interesting glitch, of course, that the woman is the queen. And
Yeah.
so I love that. Immediately makes the whole thing ripe for rearrangement. I love the glamour of the 50s. I
Yeah.
love women's clothes in 1953, the second half of the 50s, the legacy of the new look as it hit the kind of British high street. I love pop music, all the records and dance bands and crooners and singers that are kind of threaded through the soundtrack of the novel. I love all of that. I love the clean cut look of male fashion, the double breasted jackets, the slick back hair. I'm really hot for all of that. My dad's look and all his contemporaries. And so it was wonderful to play with that period, but very consciously to be saying, well, this is my world. I really own that world. I
Yeah.
own that moment. And so it was, in that sense, a conscious reckoning with my own particular background.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And particularly because that sense of time and place was so vivid throughout. Because I was sort of thinking
Good.
there's that because in some ways there's some aspect of that that's sort of not necessarily forever gone, but you don't have as many. It's not as common that the average Brit for their holidays is going to go to the seaside, is going to go to see these sort of little magic tricks on the pavilion, or or like by the seaside. That there's sort of
Yes.
a very specific era that's sort of attached to and I think there was such a sort of magic. I mean, without pun unintended, but such a magic to that
Yeah.
in the book that you do feel this sort of whole country coming alive in one go, which I mean, in my lifetime, I've maybe not seen quite the same way, apart from maybe Diana's wedding. I think
Yeah.
that's sort of maybe the closest I could sort of pin to on that.
And there was also something else that I really enjoyed doing. My husband and I, we lived in Brighton for 25 years, where the novel is set. And we don't live there anymore. We've moved back to London to grow old disgracefully. But it was wonderful to be able to use my very intimate knowledge of the town
Mm.
and its back alleys and its secrets and its stories to map
Mm.
a disappeared Brighton across the Brighton that I knew
Yes.
when I lived there, and the fascinating, um, the complete nonsense of the idea that queer people didn't really exist in 1953, or
Mm.
if they did, they were all under wraps. This is, absolutely not true. And so it
Yeah.
was lovely to be able to write a visit to the most famous queer pub in Brighton in 1953 and to talk about the cruising grounds and to talk
Yeah.
about the glances between gay men
Mm.
on the street and their beautiful secret lives. Very lightly, it's not a novel about shock horror, the twilight world of the 1950s, homosexual. It's really about one very particular and
Yeah.
very. I mean, Reggie is a strange little beast. He's one in a million, and
Mm.
it's really about seeing that world through his eyes, his very young eyes.
Yeah.
Although he's in his early 20s, he's still in many ways a child. And
Yeah.
it's only in the very last paragraph of the novel that you feel him saying, "Oh, I'm me.
Yeah.
Maybe everything will be fabulous."
Absolutely.
Um, and I wanted to wave my authorial magic wand and say, the good thing, darling, is you're on the right side of history. Everything is going to be fabulous. Good luck.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
a very important part of the book, was to talk about, to embody, not to
Mm.
talk about at all, but to embody humor and courage
Yeah.
and the glorious arts of survival that we have as queer people.
Absolutely. I think that really struck me. I think there's so much about, and again, this doesn't give things away, but there's a moment where he is overhearing some people talking about a local bar that's known, the one that you mentioned, that's sort of known to be the sort of where the gays go,
Yeah.
and I thought there was something so, because Reggie throughout the book is relatively quiet, right? He doesn't
Yes.
speak a great deal.
No. No. No.
He is mostly just observing and watching. And I think so much of the book passes in those glances between people, or Reggie seeing something and not quite commenting, but we know that he's going to go and do something different.
Yeah.
And he overhears this conversation about the pub, and we see him sort of tense and sort of we see him react to it, but trying not to give anything away. And I think it's something that and this isn't me just sort of, you know, putting you on the spot to make you feel uncomfortable, but I really found it just glorious, both with this and with the dress book, just those little nuances that sort of entirely spoke to me as a gay man, of sort of, I absolutely know what that glance looks like, or
Great.
that I absolutely know the subtlety of that moment of, it's not just a case of he silently panics a little bit and goes and does something. There's a whole chain of events that is set off in your head with just one of those little glances, or the kind of what's sort of transmitted and received in one of those glances. And I thought that was just so beautifully done. I think someone like Reggie is a really interesting vehicle to explore that through, because as you mentioned, he's so sort of out there compared to everybody else around him, that he almost is given the luxury of being invisible to some degree, and he can, you know, some of the ways that he sort of builds confidence with, you know, sort of he and Pamela share these conversations. We get the sense that Pamela wouldn't have that conversation with pretty much anybody else in her life, but Reggie's role as this sort of other and kind of outsider allows him kind of access to that world. So I thought, again, there's kind of coming back to what you were saying earlier, that it's almost so perfect that he is the disappearance boy in that, because his whole life is in many ways mirroring that, right? He exists to not be seen in a lot of places.
He's someone who exists in the cracks.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Between everything else. And it's interesting that you use the word see so often in talking about the novel. Lots of people have said that about it, that you really can see. And I'm thrilled to hear that, because of course it's a trick. I say very little about my people. I give you one or two details, and then you hear their voices, and I put them in very real, strange, vivid situations, and people end up seeing them. People describe them to me. People talk to them talk to me about them as if they've met them.
Yeah.
People ask me to tell them very exact. A lot of people ask me, but can you tell me what happened after the end of the book? And I have to say very gently, well, no, I can't, because these aren't you. Do you remember? They're not real people. But I hope. I mean, the ending of the book is an invitation to wonder, well, what happens the next morning, and then what happens a year afterwards, and then you kind of work it out, and you go, well, if it's 1953, and so how old would Reggie still be alive? Would Pamela's children still be alive? What and you, so that invitation to speculate on very material connections between this strange hidden world in 1953 and ours. And as you say, for me as a writer, it comes down to a very visceral recognition of, at a certain point in the act, when Pamela's costume becomes a prison, we know what that feels like. The moment when Reggie sees someone on the street and he knows that they don't know what he's thinking about them, and he smiles, we know how that smile feels. All of that. The only real history is the history of the body. It's that our bodies are what we share with the people in the past. Everything else, their shoes are different, their mindset is different, what's on their radio is different, the way they eat breakfast is different, but their body isn't different. Waking up in the morning and knowing already that you're in the wrong bed even before you've woken up. Oh, yes, I know what that feels like. So I think my art as a storyteller is always making the body central to the story without people realizing that I'm doing it. And that's why people, it's interesting. No one says to me, God, this story is so weird. No one's ever said that to me.
Right.
Because
Even,
they're
yeah.
not. They're just
No.
adorable, different human beings.
Yeah.
I love my new picture.
It's very good.
It's so good. I go, who is that hot, intelligent older man? Wow. I could go for, oh, it's me. There we go.
Nice.
I'm I'm absolutely thrilled that it's back, and I love how beautiful it looks. I think Incandescent have done a wonderful job. I loved having the chance to go back to something and revisit it.
Mm.
I haven't changed a word, to write a new forward, to get Derren to put his beautiful thoughts at the end of the book. It's been a really amazing trip to bring
Mm.
it back.
Yeah.
But I especially love the new cover. I
It's
think it's
gorgeous, isn't
great.
it? Well, thank you so much, Neil. Just as a last little bit, obviously, I absolutely love the book. I really do urge people to
Thank
go
you.
and check it out. What else are you sort of reading or have been reading recently? Are there any kind of things that you've read recently that you'd suggest at all?
Well, what I've just finished reading is I'm lucky enough to be a friend and colleague of Joelle Taylor, uh, who won the T.S. Eliot Prize for her outrageously brilliant
Oh,
book of
so
poems
good,
called
so good.
Cantos. And Joelle's just is about to publish her first novel at the
Mm.
beginning of next year. And I've just finished a sneak preview copy. So all I can say is we all have something to really, really look forward to. It's called The Night Alphabet, and order your advanced copy now. I don't even know you. I'm not sure when it's coming out. I think it's quite early next
I
year.
think it's January or
But
February. I've got an advanced copy which I've not gotten around to
it's
yet, but
oh,
I cannot wait
it's
because I mean, Kanto
it's
is one of the most
shocking.
incredible
It's
things.
shockingly good. I
Right.
mean, none of us are surprised, right? Joelle is the definition of fabulousness. Um, no, it's a really, really
Mm.
wonderful book. Yeah, so that's been my bedside table for the last 10 days.
Fab.
Highly recommended.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Fab, thank you so much, Neil. Thank you for talking with me. And yeah, please, everybody, do go and get yourself a little copy of this lovely book. Thank you so much for chatting, Neil. And yes, all the best with the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely to talk to you again. So over and out. Bye for now, Paul.
Take care. Bye bye.